I put up a poll on my YouTube channel asking the question, out of the top selling games of all time within the Pokemon world, which game had the best Pokemon in them? And truthfully, the answer that people put really surprised me. The top selling Pokemon games of all time are Pokemon Red and Blue, Pokemon Gold and Silver, and then kind of surprisingly, Pokemon Sword and Shield, and then Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And what's even more surprising were the poll results. Now, the first day of the poll being active, of course Pokemon Red and Blue, Gold and Silver were in a huge tie of having the best Pokemon. But after the second day, we kind of took a little bit of a turn. It seems that the current standing is that everyone thinks Pokemon Scarlet and Violet has the best Pokemon of all the games, and that Pokemon Red and Blue has the second best, Pokemon Gold and Silver at the third, and Pokemon Sword and Shield in dead last. So all this though is opinion. We all have them. So I wanted to try to find a very unbiased way of finding out which of these games actually did have the best Pokemon. To find out which game actually had the best set of Pokemon, I first had to rank them in different categories. The categories being originality, are the Pokemon different from real world animals and items? Diversity, were there a lot of new types/type combos added, or did they kind of rely on existing Pokemon to fill their decks and to make new typings? The gimmick, does the gimmick have a positive or negative impact on the Pokemon? And no, I'm not talking about the horrific lore that comes with Mega Pokemon. Longevity, did the Pokemon hold up over time, or did they need to be redesigned or revamped to stay relevant? And then finally, I had two categories of most notable Pokemon from these games and the least notable Pokemon from these games. And before I forget, I want to thank the member questers. Thank you so much for all your support. If you want to become a member quester and get awesome perks like early access to videos, members only Discord channels, and awesome emotes and badges to show everyone that you're supporting the Quoorn's Quest channel, hit the join button below. So how I decided to kind of give them all their ranking is that in each of the categories I just listed, I give them a 1 through 10 ranking, and then I add up those numbers and see what they get out of a possible 100. So let's start with the game that everyone on YouTube thought had the best Pokemon, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. So for originality, I gave Pokemon Scarlet and Violet a 7 out of 10. I gave it this because personally, I feel like the Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet are actually very original. Though yes, they're based off of things like dogs or like mice, they kind of have a unique twist to them, such as Greavard being a tombstone dog and kind of not really having much of like a dog atmosphere to it aside from its personality, but then it mainly looks like it has been a deceased pet, which is really, really unique and haven't really been seen a lot in the Pokemon franchise. And even Pokemon like Mousehold that are based off of literal mice that are just standing up like little cartoon characters, they have a unique gimmick behind them where they actually can multiply when they evolve, very similar to how real mice multiply very, very rapidly. In the category of diversity, I gave the Pokemon of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet a 6 out of a possible 10. I mainly gave it this because, again, looking at the types and type combos of this generation, they were kind of unique, but at the same time, they were a lot of like repetitive type combos that we have already seen in previous games. Some of the more notable ones that were actually very, very interesting were Scovillain, and honestly, the Tinkaton line, because the only other Fairy Steel type we had seen has been Mawile up to this point, and honestly, Mawile, even though I really, really do like Mawile, it's a pretty lackluster Pokemon, so I think giving the Steel Fairy typing a full evolutionary line with a lot of really in-depth lore, like with their hammer, that kind of continues through their evolution, really kind of added to this typing and made it stand out, and made it a fan favorite among the fans. Additionally, the Pikachu clone Pawmot had a very interesting type combo as well, where we saw electric fighting, which I feel like we haven't really seen before. And then also kind of looking at some of the more like pseudo-legendary Pokemon, like the Baxcalibur, they had the Dragon Ice typing, which I feel like in the past was really, really reserved for legendary Pokemon, and it's kind of nice to see that kind of start to creep into like more obtainable Pokemon as opposed to just one Pokemon in the entire game that has that typing. And then of course, looking at the Paradox Pokemon as well as the Ruin Pokemon, they have very unique typings within that as well, where they kind of feel like, obviously legendary Pokemon, but even the Paradox Pokemon typings felt very unique and kind of like maybe they were kind of also playing into this pseudo-legendary kind of vibe. Now for the gimmick of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I gave it a 9 out of a possible 10. I feel this because honestly, the idea of terrestrialization is fantastic for the Pokemon world. It adds such a heightened level of competitiveness and honestly like difficulty that the fans have been asking for so long. Like, it's so cool to be able to have a normal type Pokemon and you think your fighting type move is going to do a bunch of damage to it, only for it to terrestrialize into a ghost type. The one kind of disclaimer that I don't like about it is that yes, the gym leaders and people did not use this to the best of their ability. Obviously, they would throw out a kind of random Pokemon, and that random Pokemon would have the terrestrialization of their gym, which I think it should have been the other way around, where say you're the bug type gym leader and you throw out your final bug Pokemon and you change it into a flying type or you change it into a fire type. But in the world of competitive Pokemon and among the fan base, I think this gimmick really holds up. I could see this gimmick even going into other games, which we haven't really gotten since like, I think Generation 2 with the double battle feature going from like generation to generation to generation. And then finally, in the category of longevity, I gave the Pokemon of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet a 4 out of 10. I gave it this because honestly, looking at the decks, a lot of those Pokemon are pretty cool, but a lot of the really notable Pokemon are Paradox Pokemon. And while I might see terrestrialization continuing on throughout the generations for a while, I truthfully don't see this idea of Paradox Pokemon going through from generation to generation unless you bring them over from something like Pokemon Home. Obviously, I could be very wrong about this, but again, looking at kind of the history of how Pokemon, like different types of gimmicks and things work, I think it's safe to say, much like Mega Evolutions, the Paradox Pokemon are going to stay mainly within Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which does make me sad because a big bulk of their Pokedex, especially with the DLC, are these cool, awesome Paradox forms, so it'll make me really sad if the longevity of those Pokemon don't hold up. But I think they're fun for the current generation, and I think they're just fun to use. For the more notable Pokemon of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I gotta give it to Cerulege. I think it is a really unique design, and honestly probably one of the more edgier designs we've gotten in a really long time. It at the same time feels kind of like a softer Pokemon with a little bit of softer like detailing and things like that we've seen from this generation, as well as it having a lot of really harsh edges and fast movements that kind of make it feel above and beyond for a Pokemon in my opinion. So I think Cerulege is one of the more notable Pokemon, obviously among fans, and kind of in the anime and things of that nature as well, but I think its design is just top notch, and I think that Pokemon has a very long like road ahead of it. And for the least notable Pokemon of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, unfortunately, I gotta give it to Tadbolt. This Pokemon to me kind of only really feels like a way for you to get Bellibolt. Like when I first started playing the game, I was looking for Bellibolt, not realizing it had a pre-evolution until I looked it up or until I found one, and I'm like, that name sounds very familiar. While it's not necessarily a bad Pokemon, it's one of those things of, I feel like Bellibolt would have been just fine being a single stage Pokemon, and that this just kind of adds an unnecessary step to it. And honestly, it just makes it even more forgotten. And before I get to the final score for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I wanted to share some thoughts that people had when the poll was actively running. So Shafes2 replied, "The newer gens have the best Pokemon designs. They're unique and fun and more complex than the previous gens." I do really agree with that because again, like I said with Cerulege and other Pokemon like it, the designs are very unique. The Pokemon we have seen in the past that have swords for hands revolve more around Scyther and things like that, which were cool, but the idea that Cerulege has these ghost flame swords to it, I think really ups its design. And with all those points added up, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet sits at a very comfortable 62 out of 100 for having some of the best Pokemon out of the best-selling Pokemon games. Now looking at the second place contender for the poll, Pokemon Red and Blue. So for originality, I gave Pokemon Red and Blue's Pokemon a 6 out of 10, mainly because I think they do a really good job of not playing so heavily into that these are just kind of like wild animals. Obviously, this being the first generation of Pokemon, I had to kind of score it a little bit differently, and so originality, well, it's the first of, like, everything feels rather original. But honestly, when you look at it, there are quite a few Pokemon that really are just what their real life counterparts are until maybe they evolve. I'm thinking of things like Pidgey or Tata, Caterpie, Weedle, Diglett, things just kind of like that, where yes, they have elements to them that obviously make them Pokemon, and when they evolve, they get a little bit more unique. But for the most part, there are quite a few Pokemon that are just turtles, they're just lizards, they're just balls, they're just things that, you know, like, you can kind of find or might be kind of easy to create, but then you have to use your imagination to kind of make them unique. And then again, for diversity, I gave them a 5 out of 10. Again, I had to score them a little bit more critically in my opinion because they're the first. So when you don't have a lot of other things to go off of, like they had just mainly their original Pokemon typings with a few added in from the original card game. But honestly, I think this kind of makes a lot of sense because there is, in my opinion, an abundance of water types and grass type Pokemon in Pokemon Red and Blue as opposed to Pokemon like fire types or Pokemon like ice types. There's very few fire types you can get throughout the game aside from your starter, Ponyta, and Magmar. And then also there's not a lot of ice types. Pretty much every single ice type is attached to a water type, which kind of just, like, to me that just kind of makes it uninteresting when your only true ice type is something like Jinx. And kind of same for the dragon typing. The fact that there's only one dragon line Pokemon in the whole game, I'm a big believer that Charizard should have had a dragon typing, but that's for a separate video. And you might be asking yourself, what gimmick was there in Pokemon Red and Blue? Being the first game, they were just kind of throwing things out there, weren't they? And to that I did have to think very, very critically because yes, there wasn't really a gimmick because there wasn't really anything to go off of, or so I thought. So since Pokemon was technically a card game first with a very similar battle mechanic, I decided to make the gimmick the HM feature because it was something that was supposed to integrate your Pokemon within the world of Kanto. And for that, I give it a solid 4 out of 10. Because truthfully, the HMs were not a good design. They not only lasted for too long, they were so limiting on your Pokemon. The longevity of that gimmick was just not good, and it also, even while it was prevalent, it limited your team so badly unless you wanted to have one specific Pokemon to learn all the ones you needed. And that is where I kind of had my issue with the first generation's gimmick of HMs, because yeah, you have Pokemon that like can't learn some HMs. There's a lot of Pokemon that can't learn the HM cut, and you need cut to go around places. And you can't delete these, and they're not very powerful. So it's one of those things of once you're stuck with it, you're stuck with it, and you have to just keep adding more as the game goes on. Some do obviously a lot of damage. I'm thinking of my flies, my surfs, stuff like that. That I had no problem teaching to Pokemon of a little bit higher caliber, but truthfully, yeah, the gimmick of Generation 1 was really just, they tried something and I'm glad it's gone. And then finally, in the category of longevity, I gave Pokemon Red and Blue a solid 8 out of 10. Even though I might like some Pokemon from the newer generations more, it's hard to argue with the original design and concept. Without it, we wouldn't have all the amazing 1,000 plus other Pokemon that we have in existence. And it's one of those things of I think they do hold up rather well over time because they keep getting added into future games. They aren't necessarily always expanded upon right away. They're expanded upon after years and years and years of people using the Pokemon. Like the first time that I really remembered seeing a Generation 1 Pokemon like have an abundance of expansions was in the Alola region when we started getting regional forms, where they just kind of took a lot of Generation 1 Pokemon and revamped them. And honestly, after that many years of playing with a Raichu, I'm very glad they gave it a new typing and kind of some new gimmicks to go along with it. And then for me, one of the most notable Pokemon of Generation 1 was Gyarados. I feel like looking at its original sprite and looking at its sprites in current games, it really hasn't changed a lot. You can really tell that this was a Pokemon from the beginning. It has a very kind of complex yet simple design, as well as, the design hasn't been too altered over the time. Yes, we can now see that its mouth is closed on occasion, but we still kind of have it a little bit more open. I was really debating between Gyarados and Arcanine, but looking at the Arcanine sprite compared to Arcanine now, the original sprite for Arcanine was so much more beastly compared to now. Yes, it's still a big, beefy dog, but they've really softened it over time. They've kind of turned it into more of like a very stern guardian, whereas as the first sprite it had in Pokemon Red and Blue, it looked very, very wild, and even into Fire Red and Leaf Green, it still kind of had this wild vibe to it, where now, I'm sorry to say, I think we might have domesticated Growlithe and Arcanine a little too much. And then for the least notable Pokemon out of the Red and Blue Pokemon, I gotta give it to Bellsprout. Nothing wrong with Bellsprout, I do like the Bellsprout line, but again, it feels like a Generation 2 Pokemon. That might just be biased because in Generation 2 they did have the Bellsprout Tower and things like that, but I guess adding in that piece of lore with it within Generation 2 made me feel like that's where it truly belonged. And since they are so close on the map, maybe it did originate from Johto and it just happened to come to Kanto and it was first documented in Kanto. Who knows, maybe we'll see something like that in a Legends Arceus game. Alright, and while I tally up the totals from that round of things, let's look at what some of the questers over on YouTube had to say about Pokemon Red and Blue's Pokemon. XX Rainy Day XX says, gotta go classic blue and red. Sure, we've gotten a ton of great additions since the OG, but you can't beat perfection. What would I give for a remastered or remake of the original games? So I agree with that quite a bit, is that yes, the Pokemon from the original games really are outstanding designs. They were the first, again, they were the blueprint, they're what we got. It wasn't like something of, oh, the first round of games did horrible and then someone just gave them a second chance later. The first round of games were a huge, huge success, meaning that the Pokemon designs and the Pokemon in there were also a very big success, especially for the time. Now, as far as a remake and stuff goes, before you all go for rain in the comments, I do have to say, I think having a true remake or true access to Red and Blue in the current console series would actually be very, very cool. Because there's a lot of gameplay that changed over the years, and I think players would get a really refreshing taste of difficulty increasing because of how the moves and how abilities and things have changed over time. And when I played my copy of Pokemon Blue on the cartridge, I was very much reminded of how difficult that game could really be. So I think it would be cool to have a true remake or even a port on the Switch of this game so that people kind of got a taste for how the game used to operate from when it was first released, and they can maybe appreciate some of the things now. And now with all the points tallied from all the different categories, for Pokemon Red and Blue, it is sitting at a very high 95 out of 100, just 5 points short of a perfect score. Now let's talk about the third most voted option from the YouTube poll, Pokemon Gold and Silver. For originality, I gave Pokemon Gold and Silver a 7 out of 10. I gave it this, which is higher than what I gave for Pokemon Red and Blue, simply because I think in Generation 2, they started getting a little bit more experimental with their Pokemon designs. Mainly because they started integrating things that, such as Slugma and Magcargo, that were more elemental. You got Pineco and Forterris that I think were really cool designs, which is a very interesting take on a pine cone. They turned it into this big beefy because it learns the move Explosion, bomb. The thing falls from the trees and just explodes on trainers and things like that. For the diversity, I gave Pokemon Gold and Silver a 5 out of 10. Again, not really having a lot to work with, much like in Red and Blue. The typings were all pretty similar. They added the Dark typing and the Steel typing, but I think unfortunately, they just didn't really go far enough with adding these types of Pokemon or adding these typings to Pokemon. Like, when you think of Steel-type Pokemon from Generation 2, you mainly think of Steelix. Magnemite does come to mind on occasion, but Steelix is the big ticket for your Steel-type Pokemon in Pokemon Generation 2. And then, honestly, you kind of forget about Dark-type Pokemon a bit. I feel like most people would think, oh, Umbreon is the only Dark-type Pokemon from Generation 2, but we actually have the Houndour line and Sneasel that were Dark-type Pokemon, and the final evolution of Larvitar, Tyranitar. But I feel like they kind of get lost in the shuffle just because, again, they were kind of paired with other typings, or they just kind of didn't really feel maybe like the Dark-type Pokemon, or maybe they just weren't brought to light as much as they should have been. And I think the gimmick of Pokemon Gold and Silver is a solid 10 out of 10. The gimmick of Pokemon Gold and Silver, if you don't know, is the idea of breeding your Pokemon. So that's when they introduced Pokemon eggs, but they also introduced double battles, and I'll talk about both. So first, talking about the Pokemon eggs. The Pokemon eggs, I think, have been a fan favorite from the get-go. From the first time we hatched our first little Togepi, fans have been using the Pokemon egg system for not only creating unique teams from the get-go, but also for getting the infamous shiny Pokemon, which were also introduced in Generation 2. And having the method for getting it be you can hatch them through eggs, just really I feel like made a lot of people appreciate that and want that gimmick throughout the game. So much so that in Generation 8, we literally got a daycare that was just about eggs. You stopped being able to raise your Pokemon in daycares, and they were just there to make eggs for you. And then of course, in Generation 2, they also gave us double battles, and I think double battles is one of those things that really did hold up over time, simply because it added a new kind of flair to the Pokemon franchise. Like, you look at games for the GameCube, such as Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, where the whole thing was you always did double battles. Even in the Indigo Disc that we got all the way in Generation 9, their gimmick, one of their big gimmicks was that everyone did double battles. And I think that's really cool, and it just adds to the playstyle, especially because it translates over well into the competitive feel of the real world, how people interact with Pokemon. I think it's just a really cool gimmick that just adds a level of difficulty that translates through the generations. You can have two Pokemon out in a field. It's not that complicated. Alright, you can let me know if I'm being a little too harsh with this one in the comment section, but I think out of the Pokemon in Gold and Silver, the longevity is a solid 4 out of 10. I mainly think this because I think a lot of the Generation 2 Pokemon had a really hard time staying relevant, or they had some really cool conceptual ideas, but unfortunately, since Pokemon didn't think they would continue after Generation 2, I feel like they just kind of had a lot of Pokemon they just kind of stopped. I'm thinking like Dunsparce, I'm thinking Sneasel, I'm thinking other Pokemon like that. I feel like they had a resurgence, and in Generation 4, they had to really go back in and say, okay, let's give a lot of these Pokemon new evolutions, let's give them some fun new things to go with it, to make people want to use these Generation 2 Pokemon and not just forget about them. Again, unfortunately, I think a lot of Pokemon like Gligar, Porygon, poor Porygon, for 3 generations had to be updated because, granted, it's a pretty cool update all the way from Gen 1 to Gen 2 and then skipping Gen 3 to Gen 4, getting a final update, but I feel like that just kind of proves that that Pokemon needed something to stay relevant, whether you're talking about competitively battling or just the design and just the usability within the games. I don't know, I feel like a lot of Generation 2 Pokemon got a glow up in Generation 4 and beyond, such as some Pokemon getting Legends Arceus forms, getting forms in Paldea. I mean, I love Generation 2, but I feel like the longevity of it, Pokemon thought they were at the end when they were only just at the beginning. But that doesn't mean that Gold and Silver doesn't have some notable Pokemon. For me, I think the most notable Pokemon from Generation 2 is the Teddiursa line. Don't come for me. Maybe I'm being extra biased on this because I just like Teddiursa, but something about it just looks like a Generation 2 Pokemon. And especially with Ursa Ring coming after, it looks just uniquely complex. because you can look at it and say, oh, it's just a little teddy bear, or oh, it's just a big grizzly bear. But there are such small little design elements, from the crescent moon on Teddy Ursa's head and the kind of vacant, childlike expression that it has in its sprites, to Ursa Ring's big, beefy, like, broadness with the big moon ring on its front without it being obvious that it's a moon. And then at the same time, it has some nice little flair on its sides. You know, it has kind of that, like, the fur kind of flaps and stuff like that, which I think just kind of simply add to it. Without it, I think it would look too much like a bear, but with it, it just adds that nice little bit of flair, and the expression it always has of always just looking kind of like, I think it just really adds a lot to that Pokemon, and I think the Teddy Ursa line is a great representation of Pokemon Generation Gold and Silver. But with every great Pokemon comes a not so great Pokemon, or the least notable. I think the least notable of Generation 2 is Skarmory. It was one of those Steel type Pokemon that were added that I even forgot to list earlier. But to me, it's always felt like a Generation 3 Pokemon. That's also kind of why I said Donphan wasn't my favorite from Generation 2, or wasn't the most notable. To me, it is, because I love Donphan. But honestly, for the longest time when I was like a really small kid, I thought Donphan was a Generation 3 Pokemon. I didn't realize it was from Generation 2, much like Skarmory. It feels more at home in the region of Hoenn than it does in Gold and Silver. And again, while I'm tallying up all the points from that round, let's look at what some people had to say over on YouTube about Gold and Silver. Nacho writes, I gotta give it to Gold and Silver. Some of the best legends, the beasts, Totodile and Cyndaquil line, Larvitar line, evolutions to older Pokemon that were great, Steelix, Kingdra, Slowking, Espeon, and Umbreon. And I do agree with that statement quite a bit, is that not only did Generation 2 have a lot of solid new Pokemon like the starters, legendary beasts, and things like Larvitar, but they also expanded upon Pokemon that did need it from Generation 1. Onix was a very cool Pokemon, but definitely needed Steelix. Seadra was a very cool Pokemon, but definitely needed the Kingdra evolution. So I think that that's a fantastic statement, and I wholeheartedly agree. They had really, really good Pokemon, and they made a lot of very, very smart Pokemon choices as they made that Pokemon Dex. And with all things considered, the final score for Pokemon Gold and Silver is a 62 out of 100. We have one more generation of Pokemon to go through before we find out where these actually rank according to my system. And I just want to say, for those of you sticking around for the video, thank you so much. And hey, think about subscribing, think about leaving a comment, letting me know what you think about the rankings so far. And then with the YouTube poll coming in at unfortunately dead last, we have Pokemon Sword and Shield, which was a generation I actually kind of liked quite a bit. For originality, I gave Pokemon Sword and Shield an 8 out of 10. I think that because it is a later generation, they had to get a little bit more creative. When you look back at Generation 6, which was the Kalos region, I feel like a lot of people made a lot of fun of those Pokemon because they resembled earlier designs, or they were literally a set of keys with a Nissan Ultima key on it. And I think the Pokemon Company heard that. They saw the memes, they saw the feedback, they maybe even saw videos like mine, and maybe are watching this one. Probably not. But I think a solid 8 out of 10 for Pokemon Sword and Shield on the originality is very, very fitting, because there were just so many unique designs, even though we had already seen a lot of these types of Pokemon before. We've seen generation upon generation of bug Pokemon, but making the early route bug Pokemon this kind of alien feel to it was really, really cool, as well as who can forget a little snow worm like Snom, and having a very beautiful take on a moth Pokemon. We had seen many types of moth Pokemon before, but they were always a little bit more gritty. Seeing Frostmoth, I think, really gave a lot of people new appreciation for bug-type Pokemon, and I think it was a good choice on the Pokemon Company's end. And then for the diversity of Pokemon Sword and Shield, I gave it a 7 out of 10. I think that's pretty high, but honestly, a couple Pokemon were really the ones that, like, boosted this number up. Obviously, the big ones were the fossil Pokemon. The fossil Pokemon of Generation 8 were so beyond goofy. Their designs maybe weren't 10 out of 10s, but who doesn't love a good crack at some English archaeologist that put some bones together wrong? But because of that, that led to some very, very unique typings, in my opinion. Typings we'd have really only seen, I feel like, again, in legendary Pokemon or maybe pseudo-legendary Pokemon. But these were just fossils. Not that fossils, like, don't have their own kind of, like, right to them, but they followed a very static kind of tradition in the past, and then this generation really kind of flipped it on its head of, we don't have any of these Pokemon having a base of rock type. They are all kind of unique typings, or their typings work within each other. And then I also gotta give credit to Applin, because it's a grass dragon type Pokemon. I feel like Applin was kind of the first stage in this resurgence of dragon Pokemon, so I want to give it the credit that where credit is due, because once fairy type Pokemon came around, honestly, so many dragon type Pokemon really got knocked out. But Applin and Appleton just, I feel like, really held their own and kind of helped within that community of dragons kind of suck now, but they kind of started that revolution of let's give them some different stats. Let's make them not just these big, powerful, beefy things, but these kind of unique typings and unique design Pokemon. So for that is why I gave it that score. And then for the gimmick, Sword and Shield also ranked very high on my gimmick scale. I gave it an 8 out of 10. I think Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing was one of the coolest things added to the Pokemon games, mainly because who doesn't want to have their Pokemon blown up to gargantuan size in a giant arena full of spectators? I think that was just a really cool way to do Pokemon gyms and also give players, similar to Z moves, similar to terrestrialization, something that wasn't specified to specific Pokemon. Because that's always my thing with Mega Evolution. I never thought Mega Evolution had a very long longevity to it, because at some point you're just going to give every single Pokemon a Mega Evolution. But what I like about Dynamaxing is that not only does it allow every single Pokemon to become powerful, it does give a little bit of a buff to itself of you can only have it for 3 turns, where I feel like when you look at terrestrialization, that's where it kind of falls apart for me a little bit. They're terrestrialized for the rest of that battle, where you really had to think strategy when you wanted to Gigantamax or Dynamax your Pokemon, because yeah, they got 3 moves to hit really hard or be really defensive, but after that they were back down to what they were and could get knocked out immediately or suffer some other consequences. And plus, you got a really cool form change with some of them, which I think, longevity-wise, if they didn't have form changes throughout other games, if they kept Dynamaxing, every Pokemon could Dynamax, so I think that's an easy thing to do. You just kind of blow up the proportions of that Pokemon. The biggest thing is that you had to keep then the super hype gym battles, and I really want to go back to those. The Dynamaxing, Gigantamaxing, awesome additions to the Pokemon franchise, especially in Generation 8. And then for the final category, the longevity of the Pokemon in Pokemon Sword and Shield, I gave them a 5 out of 10. They were pretty unique, but honestly, a lot of them were kind of just new takes on previous Pokemon, so it's one of those things that they've kind of already gone as far as they could. I'm thinking of things like Mr. Rhyme just kind of being a variation of Mr. Mime, or like Meowth getting some new kind of forms and new evolutions, as well as Zigzagoon getting new forms and evolutions. I don't know, it's one of those things that I feel like Sword and Shield had a lot of awesome regional forms that kind of expanded upon existing Pokemon, but because they're regional forms, it doesn't quite make sense to have them in other regions all the time. They kind of are going to have to be on the back burner, or we're going to have to be near the Galar region to kind of see them again, or get them through special events. And looking at some of the most notable Pokemon out of Generation 8, I honestly gotta give it to Dreadnought. I think Dreadnought's design is really cool and really speaks to that generation. Generation 8 was one of those games where, just coming off of Pokemon Sun and Moon, that game was very vibrant, and obviously this game was not as vibrant, but honestly the color palette was still very, very vibrant compared to other Pokemon games. And I think the color palette as well as the shiny of Dreadnought really kind of played into this world of like, it's a little bit of exaggerated reality. It's not as like, it felt pretty grounded given that we were in this industrialized world and things like that, but it was really cool to kind of see that this Pokemon kind of embodied the feeling of this generation, as well as this design really blending in well with previous generations, in my opinion. It wasn't too crazy, it wasn't too cutesy, it wasn't like, it was like the right amount of edge and the right amount of soft. Very similar to Ceruledge. It kind of felt like it had lots of details from it that could play into earlier generations as well as the later generations where like the 3D modeling kind of made things a little bit softer. And then for the least notable Pokemon, I gotta give it to Squavette because honestly, you could plop that, like that thing's plopped in Paldea all the time and it looks like a Paldean Pokemon. It doesn't really have a lot of unique features to it, unlike its evolution. I think Squavette just is like, it's a squirrel, and that's kind of all there is to it. At least with Greedent, it has this whole thing of like, it's really chunky, it has a kind of a cute face, and there's lots of berries in its tail, and it has its fur kind of all over the place because it's just like trying to store all of its berries in it. Like, I don't know, Squavette just kind of very much feels like it is a squirrel that they just kind of made a few alterations to fit into the Pokemon world. And then while I do the final tally on these points, let's look and see what people had to say about Pokemon Sword and Shield over on the YouTube poll. Candy Eggs stated, Sword and Shield might have my least favorite starters, but it more than makes up for it with the consistently unique, striking, and ecosystem-filling new Pokemon. We finally got enough Pokemon to have reasonable ecosystems in open-world environments. Urban mons like Squavette and Applin will continue to be stable characters to be seen in future games, as will iconic freshwater Pokemon like Cramorant and Trudel. Askew even takes the most forgettable Pokemon of Gen Blank in stride, with its no ice face form being funnier every time you forget about it. The cool focused Pokemon designs in the gen also really hit home for me. Copperajah, Dragapult, and Grimmsnarl are very appealing to look at and instantly recognizable, easily in the same level of appeal as Pokemon's staple and generally accepted cool guys like Charizard, Metagross, and Tyranitar. I think that was like really incredibly like well said and brings up a lot of good points. I do think as far as the ecosystem goes, Pokemon Sword and Shield gave us all the Pokemon we needed for a very true open world game, because obviously it was one of the first to do the open world concept where you had the overworld Pokemon running around at all times. And so they had to really think of how to fill that world. Even though I might think Squavette is a little bit forgettable, they bring up a really good point of you can drop it in any urban environment, something that Pokemon really didn't have a lot of except for rats and pigeons. And with all the points tallied, let's take a look at the final scores out of 100 for each of these best-selling Pokemon games. Coming in at last, we have, with 62 points, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and Pokemon Gold and Silver. Coming in second with 73 points, we have Pokemon Sword and Shield. And then coming in at the number 1 with 95 points, we have Pokemon Red and Blue. Now, looking at these games from what I was kind of hoping was a more unbiased lens, I'm really not too surprised with this. Honestly, with Pokemon like Red and Blue not having a lot of substance like in these future games and not a lot to really compare it to necessarily, I was kind of expecting it to have a very high score, but again, it was the first. It was the one that set the standard for everything. I was surprised that Pokemon Sword and Shield did come in second. I think honestly the gimmick and some of the other elements really amped that one up to give it the score of 73. And then I was surprised that Pokemon Gold and Silver and Scarlet and Violet did tie. I do think they kind of had a lot of polar opposites going for them, from being the second game to being the most recent game we've had at this time. there's a lot of things that can change throughout the games, and a lot of things that can obviously carry over, a lot of things that didn't go so well. So those two having the kind of lower scores doesn't quite surprise me. But honestly, what did surprise me was the order of things from the YouTube poll. Again, totally did not expect Pokemon Scarlet and Violet to take the cake on that one, with Red and Blue coming in second, Gold and Silver coming in third, and then unfortunately Sword and Shield coming in last. But joke's on them. According to this number calculations that I did, these are the real true numbers in the true order. Let me know in the comments if you think I might have made a mistake with some of these. Thank you all for watching. Which best-selling Pokemon game had the best Pokemon? If you like this video, please let me know down in the comments, and maybe give me some suggestions of what other Pokemon games I should maybe compare Pokemon in. Obviously, you should keep up to date with the YouTube channel, like subscribing and turning on the little bell notification so that you know when I post these types of polls and when I post these types of videos, as well as game reviews and other types of fun challenges. I do appreciate all the member questers as well. Definitely hit that join button, hit that subscribe button as well. I do appreciate it, and until next time, happy questing, y'all.